Welcome back to Under Oath. Hey, Robin, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing real good. We had Barbie Day at our office about a couple days ago. And if you would have told me that a law office would have a Barbie Day, I would go, that's not going to happen. But I think the world has just moved forward so much.
Yes, there you go. You mean in terms of sexism?
Yeah, I think we become open. I mean, today's interview, I didn't realize, but I was wearing a pink shirt, and I was kind of laughing that I'm doing my Barbie interview in my pink shirt today. So
Yes, it must have been subliminal.
I think I was channeling my inner Barbie because I took my son. He's autistic, but he's 17 years old, and I took him to Barbie, and I'm trying. I've heard all this different stuff here and there, and I just wanted my own opinion on it because I tend not to try to avoid anybody else telling me what something is.
And
you know what? I liked it. I thought there was I think it covered a lot of different areas in that there's a lot of subliminal stuff in it, and there's a lot of important things. And there was one thing that I wasn't fond of because I don't like people rewriting history. I believe they played Ruth off not as this great businesswoman, but they made her look like, oh, this is the mother and I created this. And they didn't say, listen, I created Mattel. I'm the one who made this possible. And I didn't like the IRS stuff. I thought some of that was those jokes because I think she was so important to American history that I hate when people might think that's the only thing that she's about because I've seen your speeches. I've seen the way you've talked. I know her history, and she was a remarkable woman.
yes, she was. And that's why I wrote the book. And I think the reason I got to write the book is that other historians didn't want to write about her because she had this point where she kind of fell off the wagon there. It was an SEC charge, by the way, but I'm sure they felt for the movie that SEC, no one would know what that was, right? But I thought the great part of her story is that she did make a mistake and she did pay for that mistake, but she came back with this phenomenal other company helping women who'd had mastectomies. And eventually she's invited back into Mattel she's there for the 40th anniversary of Barbie. So I think everybody makes mistakes. It's the redemption part of that story that I think is terrific. So we need a Barbie movie or miniseries, and I'm working on it.
Now, the hard thing that I think about, because I'm also an attorney also, I know you're an attorney, and, I wonder, because I followed that prosecution, and it just seems like we're so quick to tear a woman down in that position in comparison to a man. And I think that's might be where it got more of its legs that, normally you'd have a civil suit. For example, Disney's going through a civil suit right now over, let's just say, some less than accurate numbers by the president of the company. And, I guarantee he won't be prosecuted. But I think we're quicker to prosecute a woman. For example, you're dealing with, Elizabeth Holmes was one of those characters that I think when we have women on huge pedestals, we're a lot quicker to try to knock them off sometimes.
I think that's still true to some extent, but in fairness to the prosecutors, they didn't just prosecute her. Now, what she would say is it was the men inside the company who were out to get me as a woman. And, there's some evidence that that might be true.
No, you're just not an author. You're right.
She did cook the books. She did cook the books. Yeah.
It's strange. I'm licensed in 18 states, and I've seen a lot of people in that position, do very similar things. And, they move on, they learn, they get fired, and then they do something at another company. And I just see it a little differently sometimes when I feel bad in a situation like that's all we remember her for. And I've studied her a little bit. I mean, she was amazing. And I wish more people knew that than the issue. Oh yeah, there were some issues with the numbers. I mean,
I don't actually hear people talk about that very much. It's, I think, one chapter in my book. Definitely the story here is a woman in 1945 who founded a company in an industry that had no women, who founded a company in an old Chinese laundry right after the war, with her husband creating and designing the products, and she could sell anything. And she loved to do it. She was a phenomenal business manager with no training and salesperson like you wouldn't believe. So I agree with you. That's the great part of her story. We don't hear enough stories about women who have done that.
I mean, what I found amazing from her was from a child, somebody who created Barbie for kids, she was never really a kid. I mean, she was working since age 10. I mean, she was an amazing business person, and it would seem that she would be the kind of kid who would never have been interested in a Barbie when she was a kid.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. She was raised, her mother, she was the 10th and last child of Polish Jewish immigrants. It's really the great American immigrant story that we see played out over and over again. And her mother, when she had Ruth, was just too tired to raise her and gave her to her older sister, who was 20, gave Ruth to Sarah to raise. And Sarah ran a store within the Denver market. So that's what she saw. That was her model for a woman, which was unusual at the time.
There's a lot of DNA that goes into this, and I try to explain that to some people sometimes. Sometimes it's who you are. And, there were moments that, I know in your book and everywhere you discuss where she walked in the first negotiation she was in, she goes, "Oh, I got to do this. I love this." And I don't think that's ever taught to you. I think sometimes that's just innate where you realize this is my destiny because this just feels like what I should be doing.
I totally agree with that. I think founders are very special people, founders of companies. They have an just unusual mix of moxie and the ability to take big risks and a huge belief in themselves that does seem to be innate.
I kind of laugh about this because when you talk about this, and I've heard you speak on a couple different occasions,
Oh,
and the idea of where Barbie came from, and I mean, it's so silly to think that it was basically it's a sex toy in a weird way that she's based on a prostitute.
yes, it straight up was a sex toy. I don't know how weird it was, but in Europe, there's definitely the cartoonist of this character, Bill Lilly, who was, as you say, a prostitute, had the idea. It was such a phenomenal, successful cartoon that he thought, well, I'll make a three-dimensional doll, and men will hang it on their rearview mirror and give it out at bachelor parties, that kind of thing. And of course, it made its way into toy stores, which is where Ruth saw it. Now, she didn't know its history at the time, but she had in her head a doll that looked like what was called Build Lily. And so she just bought three of them, brought them back to LA and said to her designer, this is what I want you to make. Call Japan right now, because it was after the war, and that's where we were making plastics, and get this doll made.
There's a gambling mentality attached to that. And the
Yes.
ability to take risk and not take risk. And, I know that Ruth became close to you because, basically it's a Jewish immigrant story.
Yes.
And my grandfather used to tell me these crazy stories about his relatives that used to that came over from Europe and everything, and that they did very weird things. Now, her father, it sounds like he left Europe because potentially for some gambling issues. And it's in her nature to do the same thing.
She loved to gamble, and yes, her father was really loved to gamble, but she did. And when that issue came up with the SEC, and she was pushed out of Mattel, she just started going to Gardena, which is still here. It's a big gambling casino in Los Angeles, and she was spending all her time gambling, but driving over there in her pink Cadillac. But she got pretty bored with that. And that's when she founded a new company, which gave her a whole different life, because she had gotten breast cancer, lost a breast to mastectomy, and discovered that the prosthetics that you could put in your bra were really horrible and made you look terrible. And so she created a realistic prosthetic, right and left, different sizes. No one had done that before. And she goes out and actually fits women personally at stores where she creates a salon for women who need these prosthetics. Bloomingdale's, Neiman Marcus. She starts at the top end. And it changes her life to help these women. She's never had that experience. And they are so moved to see themselves looking normal again. I actually met someone, I live on the West Coast. I met someone who was fitted by Ruth the other day, which has never happened to me. And it was just wonderful to hear her say, I felt like she saved my life.
I think of stories like that, and you're never going to see that in a movie. You're never going to see that in a portrayal of her. And, when I see a movie which deals with historical issues and they kind of move it around, like you mentioned, how it wasn't the IRS, it was the SEC. Now, when you teach a whole group of people, millions of people, that this is what happened, and it's false, it's not true, and it's done for entertainment value. I mean, your book is clear. It's entertaining, but it's from a historical, perspective. You're trying to keep the facts as clean as possible. That's what bothers me about when I see a portrayal of a historical event. I don't know how true it is, but I know that might be the world's new truth.
Yes, and I hear what you're saying. And I think Greta Gerwig was trying to stuff a lot into the Ruth Handler character. And like I said, we need a miniseries. Honestly, a movie isn't going to be able to capture. She had a very big life and a very interesting life. So I think we need a miniseries, and I'm working on that.
Now, you also wrote one of your fiction books, which is historically accurate, but it's Eleanor versus Ike. And it's like a hypothetical, what would happen if Eleanor Roosevelt had to run against Ike for president? And I assume you were going, God, I can see this happening. I have to write this.
Yes. Did you read it?
Oh, I read some of it. I haven't got through it all. I've tried. When I find out I have a guest, I can only read so much quickly.
Well, I love that book. It's really close to my heart. My first book was Leadership the Eleanor Roosevelt Way, and I fell in love with Eleanor. So many of us do. But I was really mad at her for not running for president, because many people encouraged her to, including Lewis Howe, who was Franklin Roosevelt's political advisor. So I thought, wait, I can fix this. I can just write a book as if it happened. So that's how I did that book. And it was at the time that we all thought that Hillary Clinton would be running against John McCain. And so I thought I would really look like a genius having Eleanor run against Eisenhower. But of course, that isn't what happened in real time, contemporary. But I love that book. I think it's a really fun book. What might Eleanor have done if she was thrust into that role? And I won't tell you the ending.
We deal with, this is an issue, Barbie and everything else is dealing with issues of feminism and women in business and women being able to do everything. But there was something interesting about your book, because there was a little fact in there that, I take for granted sometimes, that Ruth asked her husband to change to not go by his first name, to go by his middle name, so that people would not treat him differently because he was Jewish. And that was based on they got pulled over, and there was an anti-Semitic issue. I don't know why, but it seems today we gloss over these anti-Semitic problems we have even in today's world, where synagogues are shot up, where people can say horrific things, and it's because, well, we as Jews have done very well professionally, that it's okay to do these things. And I mean, do you still believe this is where we are at now?
Well, of course, not as badly as in the 40s, but it's getting there, right? There's a real rise in anti-Semitism, racism, of course, fascism, frankly, in this country. And I just went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and you're really struck when you go to a place that lays out history that way, in looking at the early years of the Third Reich, starting in 1933, and the very, very frightening parallels to where we are in this country, where we could be in this country if we don't really focus on saving our democracy.
About this interview, when I found out I was getting it, and I was going to go, let me do some research, let me figure this out. I was educated in ways that I was amazed by. And I think that our listeners, our readers, our watchers could only benefit from finding out the real facts about, Ruth and how this all came about, and might even inspire some people. So the book is in every store. We can get it through Amazon. What else can I plug for you? Because I think what you've done is fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much. This is really a very smart interview, and I appreciate it. I think if there are women and other underrepresented people who want to get wisdom from Eleanor Roosevelt, I always do plug that book, Leadership the Eleanor Roosevelt Way. Oops, sorry. Because that's really the book that talks about all my best ideas on how we can get real equality in this society.
And Ruth, Barbie and Ruth could be found in stores too, I assume.
Barbie and Ruth is not in stores now. It's been out too long for that. It's still the only biography of Ruth Handler, and you can get it on Amazon or any other online. It is certainly in print and actually selling much better, as you can imagine, since the movie came out.
I would love that if that happened with any of my books. Oh, guess what? They made a movie about this, and now your books are selling. I would love that.
Yes.
But thank you very
Right.
much for making the time for me. I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you, too. A really fun interview.